The writing of Beden. My name is Beden, son of Hachgana. My uncle, Conarid, never married and died without children. I was chosen in his place. Adel, the third king with that name, approved this choice on the condition that I acknowledge him as my master. In addition to my uncle's full inheritance, he has given me a piece of land adjoining my property, provided that I place people on it who are never of his people. 20 pages, possibly more, are missing from the manuscript, on which Beden wrote about King Adel III, known as Ubbo by our chroniclers. Therefore, I want to provide space for this subject here. Letter from Rika the Old Maiden, read at the Midwinter Festival in Stavron. Respect to all of you, descendants of Friezo. As you think, you are not guilty of idolatry. I do not want to speak about that today, but I want to draw your attention to another flaw. Flaw. You may know that Ralder has 1,000 names. But what you surely know is that he is called All-Father because everything comes from him and grows to nourish his creatures. It is true that Eartha is sometimes also called All-Mother because she produces all the fruits and grains with which humans and animals nourish themselves. But she would not produce fruits and grains if Ralder did not give her strength. Even women who feed their children at their breast are called nourishers. But if Ralder did not provide milk there, the children would not benefit. So, in the end, Ralder remains the only feeder. That Eartha is sometimes called All-Mother and a mother-nourisher can still be understood as a metaphor. But that a father allows himself to be called a feeder because he is a father goes against all logic. However, I know where this foolishness comes from. Listen, it comes from our enemies. If you follow this, you will become slaves, to the sorrow of Friar and as punishment for your pride. I will tell you how it went with the slave nations, and from that, you can learn. The foreign kings who ruled arbitrarily wanted to emulate Ralder out of jealousy that Ralder was called All-Fa. They also wanted to be called fathers of the nations, although everyone knows that a king has no control over growth and that his nourishment is brought by the people. But they wanted to cling to their audacity. To achieve their goal, they were initially not satisfied with voluntary gifts but imposed taxes on the people. With the proceeds, they hired foreign soldiers, whom they placed around their courts. Then they took as many women as they wanted, and the local princes and lords did the same. When later disagreements and complaints arose about the household, they declared, "Every man is the father, feeder, of his family, therefore, he will also be its master and judge." Thus came arbitrariness, and as it ruled over men in the family, it began to control the kings over the nations. When the kings had brought it to the point where they were called fathers of the nations, they departed and had images made in their likeness. These images were placed in churches alongside the idols, and those who refused to bow were killed or put in chains. Your ancestors and the Twisklanders came into contact with these foreign kings and learned this folly. But not only do some of your men make themselves guilty of stealing honors, I must also complain about many of your women. If there are men who want to compare themselves to Ralder, there are also women who want to do this with Freya. Because they have borne children, they let themselves be called mothers. But they forget that Freya has borne children without the intervention of a man. Not only do they want to rob Freya and the honor mothers of their rightful names, which they cannot match anyway, they do the same with the honors of their neighbors. There are women who let themselves be called ladies, although they know that this name belongs only to the wives of princes. They also let their daughters be called maidens, although they know that no young girl may be called so unless she belongs to a castle. You may think that stealing these names makes you better, but you forget that envy clings to it, and every evil has its own consequences. If you do not return, the time will come when this will grow so strong that the end is not foreseeable. Your descendants will be scourged, without understanding where those blows come from. Although you do not build castles for the maidens and leave their fate to chance, they will persist. They will emerge from forests and caves and show your descendants that you are knowingly and willingly guilty of this. Then you will be condemned, your shades will rise from their graves and invoke Ralder, Freya, and their maidens, But no one will be able to amend anything until the Joel takes a different course, which will only happen after 3,000 years from this century. End of Rika's letter. Here ended Beden's writing. 2 pages are missing according to the pagination in the manuscript, but it is undoubtedly that more is missing. The broken introduction of the next one indicates that the beginning of that writing has been lost, including the indication of the name of the writer, who may have been a son or grandson of Beden. Therefore, I want to first write about Blackadil. Blackadil was the 4th king after Friezo. In his youth, he learned on Texland, later he studied in Stavron, and then travelled through all the states. When he was 24 years old, his father chose to appoint him as Asaga Asker. Once Asker, he always advocated for the benefit of the poor. He said that the rich did enough injustice with their money, so it was our duty to ensure that the poor could rely on us. Through these and other arguments, he became the friend of the poor and the terror of the rich. It went so far that his father eyed him suspiciously. After the death of his father, he ascended the throne and wanted to maintain his office as well as the kings of the East were accustomed to. The rich did not accept that, but the common people came out in masses, and the rich were glad to come out of the gathering unharmed. From that moment on, one never heard about equality of justice again. He condemned the rich and favored the poor, whose help he used for all his affairs. King Asker, as he was always called, was 7 feet tall, and his strength matched his stature. He had a sharp mind, understood everything that was discussed, but his actions did not testify to wisdom. Despite his handsome face, he had a smooth tongue, but his soul turned out to be even blacker than his hair. A year after he became king, he forced all young men from his state to come to the camp annually and engage in mock warfare there. At first, it was difficult for him to enforce this, but eventually, it became so customary that young and old came from all corners to ask if they could participate. When he achieved this, he had military schools established. The rich came to complain, saying that their children were no longer learning to read or write. Asker paid no attention, but when mock warfare was fought again shortly after, he stood on a platform and spoke loudly, "The rich have come to me to complain that their boys do not learn enough to read or write. I did not say anything about that. But here I want to express my opinion and let the General Assembly decide." When everyone looked at him curiously, he continued, "In my opinion, nowadays we should leave reading and writing to the maidens and old wise people. I do not want to speak ill of our ancestors, I just want to say that in the times that some so praise, the castle maidens caused discord, and the mothers could not drive that discord out of the land. Worse still, while they chatter and talk about useless customs, the Golan came and robbed all our beautiful southern lands. Nowadays, they have come with our related brothers and their soldiers across the Scheldt, so we have the choice between bearing a yoke or a sword. If we want to be and remain free, the young ones must temporarily stop reading and writing, and instead of hanging out with their groups, they must play with sword and spear. When we are trained on all fronts and the boys are big enough to wear helmets and shields and handle weapons, I will, with your help, face the enemies. The Golan can then write the defeats of their helpers and soldiers on our fields with the blood dripping from their wounds. Once we have driven away the enemy, we must continue until there are no more Golan, Slavs, or Tartars left to drive out of Friar's heritage. That is correct, shouted most, and the rich dared not open their mouths. This speech he had certainly thought of beforehand and had it written down, for copies of it were in 20 hands that same evening, and they were all identical. Later, he ordered the shipbuilders to make double prows to which a steel bow could be attached. Whoever was negligent about this was fined. If someone could swear that he had no means, the rich in the village had to pay. Now we will see where all this fuss has led. At the northern end of Britain, which is full of high mountains, there is a Scottish people, mostly descendants of friars' blood. Some of them are followers of the Kelton followers, and another part consists of Britons and refugees who gradually fled from the tin lands in that direction. Those who came from the tin lands all have foreign women or are of foreign race. They are all subject to the rule of the Golan, and their weapons are wooden bows and spears with points of deer horn or flint. Their houses are made of sods of grass and straw, and some even live in the caves of mountains. The sheep they have stolen constitute their only wealth. Among the descendants of the Keltana followers, some still possess iron weapons inherited from their ancestors. To be well understood, I must set aside my story about the Scottish people and write about the distant Crecolanden, Italy. The distant Crecolanden formerly belonged exclusively to us, but since time immemorial, descendants of Lida and Finda have settled there, and eventually, a whole group came from Troy. Troy was thus a city that was taken and destroyed by the people of the distant Crecolanden, Greece. When the Trojans settled in the distant Crecolanden, they painstakingly built a strong city with walls and fortresses, called Rome, meaning spacious. After that was done, the people seized the entire land through cunning and violence. The people living on the south side of the Mediterranean Sea are mostly Phoenicians. The Phoenicians, Punics, are a mixed race, consisting of friars. Blood, Finda's blood, and Lida's blood. The people of Lida are their slaves, but due to the debauchery of the women, these black people have corrupted and darkened all the other races. This people and that of Rome are constantly in conflict for control over the Mediterranean Sea. Furthermore, the Romans are in enmity with the Phoenicians. Their priests, who solely rule over the empire and the earth, are not allowed to see the Golan. First, they took Massalia from the Phoenicians, then all lands lying to the south, west, and north, including the southern part of Britain, and everywhere they expelled the Phoenician priests, that is, the Golan. After that, thousands of Golan moved to North Britain. Recently, the supreme god of the Golan sat on the fortress there, named Karanak, meaning corner. And he gave his orders to all Golan. Also, all their gold was collected there. Karanhern, chosen corner, or Karanak is a stone fortress that belonged to Kalta. Therefore, the maidens of the descendants of the Kaltana followers wanted to reclaim the fortress. Thus, due to the enmity between the maidens and the Golan, a conflict over the highlands arose, with murder and devastation. Our sailors often went there to obtain wool, which they bought with prepared hides and linen. Asker had been there many times. Secretly he had made friends with the maidens and some princes and allied himself to drive the Golan out of Karanak. When he returned, he gave the princes and warriors iron helmets and steel bows. War broke out, and soon blood flowed in torrents on the slopes of the mountains. When Asker thought the opportunity was favorable, he set out with 40 ships and took Karanak and the supreme of the Golan with all his gold. The people with whom he had fought against the soldiers of the Golan, he had lured from the Saxon marks with promises of great spoils and loot. Nothing was left for the Golan. Later, he took 2 islands as anchorages for his ships, from where he later went out to plunder all Phoenician ships and cities he could reach. When he returned, he brought almost 600 of the largest boys from the Scottish mountain people. He claimed they were given to him as hostages, ensuring the loyalty of their parents. But that was not true. He kept them as a bodyguard at his court, where they received daily lessons in riding and handling various weapons. The Danes, who had long considered themselves proud sailors, became jealous when they heard of Asker's glorious deeds. They were so envious that they wanted to wage war over the sea and his lands. Here is how he could avoid a war. Among the ruins of the destroyed fortress Stavia lived a clever castle maiden with a few maidens. Her name was Ranger, and she had a great reputation for wisdom. This maiden offered Asker her assistance on the condition that Asker would rebuild the fortress Stavia. After committing to this, Ranger, accompanied by 3 maidens, went to Hals. She traveled at night and spoke at markets and gatherings during the day. She claimed that Ralda, through thunder, had summoned her, stating that the people of Freya must become friends, united as sisters and brothers, otherwise, the people of Finda would come and wipe them all from the earth. Following that thunder, Freya's 7 guardian maidens appeared in her dreams for 7 consecutive nights. They said, over Friar's lands hangs the danger of disaster with yoke and chains. Therefore, all nations descended from Friar's blood must discard their nicknames and refer to themselves only as Friar's children or Friar's people. Moreover, everyone must rise and drive the people of Finda out of Friar's heritage. If they fail to do so, they will wear slave chains around their necks. Foreign rulers will abuse their children and have them flogged until blood wells up in their graves. Then, the spirits of their ancestors will come to accuse them of their cowardice and carelessness. The naive people, already accustomed to much foolishness due to the Magyars, believed everything she said, and the mothers clasped their children to their breasts. After Ranger persuaded the king of Hals and all the other people to unite, she sent messengers to Asker and traveled herself along the Baltic Sea. There, she went to the Lithuanians, named because they always hack their enemies in the face. The Lithuanians are fugitives and exiles from our own people who reside in the Twisklands and wander around. They have mainly abducted women from the Tatars. The Tatars are a part of Finda's lineage, named by the Twisklanders because they never seek peace and always challenge people to fights. She then traveled through the Saxon marks, across other Twisklands, proclaiming the same message everywhere. After 2 years, she came back home along the Rhine. She had presented herself to the Twisklanders as the mother and told them they could return as free people. However, they had to cross the Rhine and drive the Gola followers out of Friar's southern lands. If they did that, King Asker would cross the Scheldt and take the land. The Twisklanders had adopted many bad habits from the Tatars and Magyars, but many of our customs had also been preserved. Therefore, they still had maidens who educated the children and advised the elders. Initially hostile towards Ranger, they eventually followed and supported her wherever it was useful and necessary. As soon as Asker heard from Ranger's messengers how the Jutes had voted, he immediately sent messengers on his behalf to the king of Hals. The ship on which the messengers sailed was laden with women's jewels, and there was also a golden shield on which Asker's figure was artistically depicted. These messengers were to inquire whether Asker could have the king's daughter, Freyþjónsdóttir, as his wife. Freyþjónsdóttir came to Stavren a year later. Among her retinue was also a Magi, as the Jutes had long been corrupted. Shortly after Asker married Freyþjónsdóttir, a church was built in Stavren. In the church, malevolent, monstrous images were placed, dressed in gold-woven clothing. It was also claimed that Asker knelt there at night and at unusual times with Freyþjónsdóttir. But it is certain that the fortress Stavia was not rebuilt. Ranger had already returned and went angrily to Prontlik, the mother of Texland, to complain. Prontlik left and sent messengers everywhere proclaiming, "Asker has surrendered to idolatry." Asker pretended not to notice, but unexpectedly, a fleet came from Hals. The maidens were driven out of the fortress at night, and in the morning, only a smoldering ruin of the fortress could be seen. Prontlik and Ranger came to me for refuge. Upon later reflection, it seemed to me that the evil could be contained for my state. Therefore, we devised a scheme together that would benefit us all. Here's how we proceeded. In the middle of the Krillwood, east of Ludwood, is our fortified refuge, which can only be reached via winding paths. I had stationed young guards there for some time who detested Asker and kept everyone else away. Among us, it had already reached the point where many women and men spoke of ghosts, white women, and gnome men, just like the Danes. Asker had already used all these follies to his advantage, and now we wanted to do the same. On a dark night, I brought the maidens to the fortress, and then they went with their attendants along the winding paths, dressed in white clothing like ghosts, so that later, no one dared to come. When Asker thought he had a free hand, he let the Magyars travel through his states under various names, and except in Groningen and in my state, they were not turned away anywhere. So Asker was connected with the Jutes and other Danes, and they all went raiding together. But that did not yield good results. They brought various foreign treasures home, but precisely because of that, the young men refused to learn a trade or work in the fields, so he eventually had to take slaves. However, that was entirely against the will of Ralda and against Friar's advice. Therefore, punishment could not be avoided. Here's how the punishment came. At one point, they had together captured an entire fleet from the Mediterranean. This fleet was loaded with purple clothing and other valuables from Phoenicia. The weak people from the fleet were landed south of the Seine, but the strong people were held captive. They were to serve as slaves. The most beautiful ones were kept to stay on land, and the ugliest and blackest were kept on board to row the benches. When dividing the loot, the punishment was also distributed without them knowing. 6 of the people placed on the foreign ships died of belly pain. It was thought that the food and drink were poisoned, so everything was thrown overboard. But the belly pain persisted, and wherever slaves or goods went, the belly pain also came. The Saxons brought it across their marks. With the Jutes, it went to Schoonland and along the coasts of the Baltic Sea. With Asker and his sailors, it went to Britain. We and the people of Grenoble allowed no goods or people across our land borders, and therefore, we were spared from the belly pain. How many people the belly pain has swept away, I cannot write, but Prontlik, who heard it later from other maidens, told me that Asker helped 1,000 times more free people from his states than he brought in dirty slaves. When the plague had disappeared for good, the liberated Twisklanders came to the Rhine, but Asker did not want to stand on equal terms with the princes of that dirty, mixed people. He did not want to allow them to call themselves friars' children, as Ranger had proposed. But he forgot that he himself had black hair. Among the Twisklanders, there were 2 peoples who did not call themselves Twisklanders. One people came from the far southeast and called themselves Alemannen. They had adopted this name when they still roamed the forests as exiles without women. Later, they abducted women from the slave people, just like the Lithuanians, but they kept their name. The other people, who roamed more nearby, called themselves Franks, not because they were free, but Frank was the name of the first king who had made himself a hereditary king over his people with the help of the degenerate maidens. The peoples bordering him called themselves Thiath his sons, which means people's sons. They remained free people because they never wanted to acknowledge a king, prince, or master, except the one chosen by general will at the General Assembly. Asker had already heard from Ranger that the princes of the Twisklanders were usually in enmity and discord. Now he suggested that they choose a duke from his people because he was afraid that otherwise they would fight for dominion. He also said that his princes could speak with the Golan. That, he said, was also the mother's opinion. Then the princes of the Twisklanders gathered, and after 3 times 7 days, they chose Auric as duke. Auric was Asker's nephew. He gave him 200 Scots and 100 of the largest Saxons as a bodyguard. The princes had to send 3 times 7 of their sons to Stavren as pledges of their loyalty. So far, everything had gone according to his wishes, but when they were to cross the Rhine, the king of the Franks did not want to be under Auric's command. This threw everything into confusion. Asker, who thought everything was going well, landed with his ships on the other side of the Scheldt, but there they were already aware of his coming and on guard. They had to flee as quickly as they had come, and Asker himself was captured. The Golan did not know who they had captured, and so he was later exchanged for a significant Gaul who had brought Asker's people. While all this was happening, the Magyars were still more audacious over the lands of our neighbors. At Igmuda, where the fortress Foana had stood before, they built a church that was even larger and richer than Asker's in Stavren. Later, they said that Asker lost the battle against the Golan because the people did not want to believe that Woden could help them, and therefore, they did not want to worship him. Afterward, they left and abducted young children, whom they kept and raised in the secrets of their corrupt doctrine. Were there people who? The rest is missing.